All right. Hello, everyone. I'd like to first briefly thank the organizers of the conference for setting it up in these trying times. I'd like also to thank you, the viewers at home. I hope you're there in good numbers despite the context. In his excellent synthesis on the history of Canadian suburbanization, Richard Harris concludes his analysis in 1960, explaining that by that year, the trends and patterns that would dominate the rest of the 20th century, among them the rise and prevalence of corporate developers, were set and would not change significantly. By the same token, in my own research on the subject, I explored the history of Montreal suburbs from the late 19th century up to the 1950s and 1960s. In this paper, and in the spirit of this conference, I'll try to address the question of what happens to suburbia and the suburban dream after those iconic decades. Is suburbia truly triumphant? Has it changed significantly in the late 20th century? And if so, how? Finally, as historians, what trails should we follow if we want to historicize what I would call late-stage suburbanization? To explore these questions, I'll take a closer look at the Port-Saint-Raphaël project on Montreal's Île Bizarre. As you'll see, it offers an interesting case study of the triumph and transformations of the suburban form, but also of the limits of large-scale suburbanization in the 1970s and 1980s. Studying suburbia raises a few paradoxes. I'll briefly discuss two of those. First, the suburban way of life has been the object of criticism for its social and cultural impact since at least the 1960s. And this criticism has been extended to its environmental unsustainability in the last 20 or 30 years. To quote Betty Nicolaides, in the post-war era, Elle moved from the city to the suburbs. Still, despite these critiques, suburbanization has continued without pause and well beyond what was expected by some of its early critiques. So the first paradox would be the fact that this way of life that has transformed and continues to transform Canadian society has been understudied and generally in a very critical perspective, with little effort made to understand its continued appeal. The second paradox would be the fact that despite this continued appeal, the death of suburbia has been announced for a while by a large number of scholars. Starting in the late 1980s, many of them, especially in urban studies, observed the rapid transformation of some North American suburbs that suggested that a triumph of classic post-war suburbia had been quite short-lived. I'm thinking of Robert Fishman's Technoburbs, Joël Garreau's Edge Cities, and John Tiford's Post-Suburbia, for example. More recently, in 2018, Roger Keel once again suggested why the suburban moment may be over. Economically unattractive, difficult to reach through existing infrastructures, unappealing to millennials, suburbs were going the way of the dodo. Yet it's not at all clear that we're living in such a post-suburban world. We need to delve more deeply into the recent history of suburbia to better understand or resolve some of those paradoxes. We need to better understand its persistence and its hold on Canadian families despite decades of criticism. By the same token, clearly the 1960s were not the end of history for suburbia, and we need to better understand its subsequent mutations. If suburbanization is, to quote Roger Keel again, the most lucrative capitalist scheme of the production of space in human history, end of quote, we need to better understand how it came to be and what has been and can be done to resist or contain it. And this is even more true today, as the pandemic seems to have simply strengthened the attractiveness of the urban periphery. And this brings me to the Port-Saint-Raphaël project. I discovered it quite by accident a year ago while preparing an interview on the history of l'Île Bizarre in the wider context of Montreal's suburbanization. While this development project was never completed, I was struck by its ambition and scale that went quite beyond those I was more familiar with in the 1950s and 1960s. Of course, when I decided to prepare a paper on the subject for this conference, I was not factoring in how the pandemic would complicate my efforts in the matter. For example, after months of efforts with an archive service that shall not be named to obtain a copy of the project's master plan, I finally received maps for the relocation of a Cree community in northern Quebec in the 1970s. It was a few hundred kilometers off, I imagine. Still, despite these obstacles, I should be able to offer you today the broad strokes of the project history and what it can tell us of the future of the study of the history of suburbanization. But first, a few words on l'Île Bizarre. It's a small island in the northwestern part of Montreal. It is named for Jacques Bizarre, a French officer who received it as a seigneurie in 1678. Settlers arrived on the island in 1735, and it remained a mostly rural settlement until the end of the 19th century, with the building of a bridge that opened the way to the construction of a handful of summer houses on the island. Still, it's only in the post-war period that things started to change significantly, in large part because of the development of the highway system. Farmers and longtime occupants of those summer houses have to contend with an increasing number of suburbanites. The move of the prestigious Royal Montreal Golf Club on the island in 1959 is certainly emblematic of that shift, and the island's population triples from 1951 to 1971, going from 1,968 inhabitants to almost 3,000. But it's in the early 1970s that businessman Robert Campeau enters the scene. A whole research project could turn around the figure of Campeau. In short, he's a Franco-Ontarian businessman that entered the construction business in 1953 and expanded it considerably in the Ottawa region in the 1960s with the help of federal contracts. This led him to numerous construction projects across Canada and the United States in the 1970s. His rise and fall are closely linked to the increasingly globalized economy of the late 20th century. In the 1980s, he made huge and disastrous investments in American department stores, including Bloomingdale's, that led to his complete bankruptcy in 1990. He died in relative poverty in Ottawa in 2017. But in the early 1970s, Campeau is a huge player in the suburban development of Montreal's metropolitan region, with deep pockets and numerous political connections. And here, I'm sorry, I could not help but use this wonderful quote from Charlotte Whitten, mayor of Ottawa, who said that the houses of Mr. Campeau was so ugly that they made a case for nuclear annihilation. Moving on. The project on l'Île Bizarre. So between 1973 and 1975, the Campeau Corporation started buying huge swaths of land on Île Bizarre, and it is estimated that by the middle of the 1970s, the corporation owned about 60% of the developable land on the island. In the meantime, architects and urbanists working for the corporation prepared an ambitious development plan. Under the always fashionable Garden City label, the plan provided for the construction of 7 distinct neighborhoods, 17 primary schools, 3 high schools, 4 community centers, and 1,500 residences. 40% of those would have been single-family detached houses, 25% row houses, and the rest apartments in office buildings as high as 20 stories in the newly created downtown. According to the plan, the whole enterprise would have taken 15 years to be built at a cost varying between $700 million and $1 billion. The project would have radically transformed the island, starting with its demography. In 1976, the island has a little over 4,000 inhabitants. By 2005, the Campeau Corporation anticipated between 90 and 100,000 inhabitants. In fact, in 2006, it was only a little over 15,000. So the project represents quite a turning point in terms of scale, but also in terms of the way it is marketed. The idea of harmonizing city and nature had been used to sell the suburban dream since at least the last third of the 19th century in Montreal. But this time, the idea of preserving nature and the environment clearly instrumentalized the discourses of a more vocal ecological movement, including the idea of reducing the use of the automobile. To realize its project, the Campeau Corporation still has at the time vast financial resources and an important ally on the ground. Indeed, Île Bizarre's mayor of the time, Bernard Patry, wholly supports the project and adopts a new zoning bylaw to pave the way for its realization in January 1975. The first phase goes ahead and leads to the construction of a little more than 400 houses in the southeastern part of the island, as you can see on this image. To anchor its first neighborhood, the corporation finances the construction of a huge and particularly ugly community center in 1976 called the Campanile. The building doubles as the local offices of the corporation for the Port-Saint-Raphaël project. But already in the late 1980s, it is abandoned, a testament to Campo's failure. So what happened? The failure of the Port-Saint-Raphaël project is really an interesting case study in the history of anti-development movements. As I was preparing this paper, I was reading Jack Little's recent study of such movements in the Vancouver region during the same period. What struck him, and the situation is similar on Île Bizarre, is how those anti-development movements operating on the urban periphery were less radical and more broad-based coalitions of residents preoccupied with the quality of their immediate environment. In the case of the Port-Saint-Raphaël project, such resistance started early on, as Mayor Patry adopted his revised zoning bylaw in 1975. The newly created Comité pour la protection de l'environnement de l'Île Bizarre presented a petition of 611 names against it. Of course, the petition was promptly ignored by the municipal council. In the following years, though, the island's inhabitants used different strategies to thwart the Campo Corporation's ambitions. One interesting feature of this resistance is the diverse type of actors involved. Local suburbanites were at the forefront of this resistance. They had chosen the island because it was quiet and more or less out of the way. Its transformation into a populous suburb of Montreal didn't fit with their own suburban dream. Wealthy and less wealthy owners of summer houses on the island were in the same boat. Perhaps more surprisingly, some of the island's remaining farmers also opposed the corporation's plan, arguing against all odds at the time that agriculture was still a viable sector on the island. But a few other important factors played a decisive role in the failure of the Port-Saint-Raphaël project. First, by the end of the 1970s, Quebec's government answered long-standing calls for the protection of agricultural lands in the province. Spearheaded by Minister Jean Garon, this effort led to the adoption of the Loi sur la protection du territoire et des activités agricoles and the creation of a commission tasked with designating protected farmlands. Soon enough, 81% of the island was placed under that protection, including most of the Campo Corporation's undeveloped land. Facing increased resistance to its efforts, the corporation finally sold in 1985 most of its land on the island to a company belonging to another promoter, Mario Grilli. The fight wasn't over, and I could keep talking about the following battles, but the tide had somewhat turned, and it is this turning point that should be studied more closely. While the Campo Corporation was still winning prizes for its development on Île Bizarre, and while La Presse was still presenting the development of the island as inevitable in the early 1980s, by the end of the decade, clearly things were changing. For example, the Metropolitan Government of Montreal, the CUM, intervened to preserve the rural character of the island despite pressures from various developers, and the Comité Environnement Île Bizarre built a large coalition of groups to ask for the preservation of the island's remaining forest. Also interesting is the way remaining farmers on the island kept on opposing their own profitability to the economic arguments of developers like Mario Grilli. The transition that would lead them to embrace biofarming later on is also an interesting potential research subject. Finally, there are clearly similar projects that could and should be studied more closely. In Montreal's periphery, for example, the Campo Corporation was behind a similar venture and failure around the development of Mont Saint-Bruno. The parallels are striking with the acquisition of land from a private association, the complicity of the municipality, and the creation of a local coalition of opponents, the Service des Loisirs de la Rive-Sud métropolitaine. The vast and prolonged campaign led by those opponents, with once again the complicity of provincial political actors, led not only to the failure of the project, but to the creation of a provincial park. So what's the latest news from Île Bizarre? As you can see on this satellite image, the anti-development efforts deployed in the 1970s and 1980s mostly succeeded in limiting its suburban development. The island is a surprisingly mixed community today, not only in terms of land use, but also in terms of the socioeconomic profile of its population. When we filmed that documentary last year, for example, it was on a farm subdivided between different bio-farming projects. Still, its status remains a subject of debates between its inhabitants, as is suggested in this very recent article from Le Devoir, published yesterday on the 26th of April, on the merits of classifying it as an area of outstanding natural beauty, the paysage humanisé. In terms of historiography, the case of the Port-Saint-Raphaël project certainly suggests that the triumph of suburbia in the post-war period is a complicated story, with corporate development increasing significantly in scale and adapting their marketing strategies to an evolving ecological sensibility, and of course, continuing to sway local elected officials to their cause, as they've done in the past. At the same time, clearly, this increase in scale led, in some cases at least, to the creation of anti-development coalitions that had some degree of success in slowing this late-stage suburbanization, often with the help of allies at other political levels. More generally, it suggests that the history of Canadian suburbs shouldn't end with the 1960s, but go beyond it to explore the various ways mass suburbanization still impacts our lives, whether we like it or not. Thank you very much.